Much. Oh, thank you too. Thank everybody. Right. I was so quick that I didn't thank Ayal and everyone here, and especially the administrators who put up with my endless emails. Okay, I'm going to take this one by one. This is such a lawyer thing. Usually we say something is over and under inclusive. Totally lawyer. So it's too broad, narrow and too broad. Probably, but what can I do in 30 minutes? But anyway, so I did try to narrow it down. In other words, I wanted to isolate something that's not really about just, accommodation generally, but claims that actually, whose deep structure I wanted to reveal, challenging the sovereignty, and for exemptions that actually involve violation of rights of members or non-members. Hobby Lobby, we're talking about a corporation that employs 13,000 people that don't share necessarily the religion of the group that claims exemption. So it was a narrow focus. So I would say that the example you give of Bob Jones fits my case, my approach, because Bob Jones was a case of tax exemption for a fundamentalist Christian university that wouldn't allow interracial dating. And these tax exemptions are for charitable, so nonprofit organizations, and the tax people basically said, well, this isn't charitable. I love the play on the words there. And they lost the tax exemption. I have yet to see anything like this happen ever in terms of gender discrimination. I'd have to hold my breath for that one. But in any case, that makes my case. So when there's discrimination involved, I don't think. Now, of course, as I said, discrimination on the basis of religion, that makes sense. Obviously, the Catholic priests don't have to hire a Jew to be, Catholic Church doesn't have to hire a Jew to be their priest. That's fairly obvious. I mean, I think under the general assumptions that regulate voluntary association, that many of the accommodations you're talking about could be in place. In other words, we don't insist on congruence between the structure of an association and the structure of the democratic state. I'm not arguing for that. But there are areas, and we accord illiberal groups, there are lots of them, not just religious, all kinds of illiberal groups, and they do their thing under certain conditions. You don't get to force the membership, you have exit, and other kinds of conditions that the state sets, which I think is very important. So I'm not arguing for congruence, but I am saying that with the shift to voluntary association as opposed to corporatism or neo-corporatism or whatever goes under that heading, it's not about alternative jurisdictions. These groups that we accommodate don't have alternative. I mean, they might, for their internal perspective, think we're living under our norms, laws, etc. That's fine. I don't want to dispute that. But the state does not cede to them its jurisdiction. Okay, that's the first thing. So I was narrow on purpose because that was the narrow dimension. But the thing that's alarming to me is that this dimension is becoming more and more prevalent in American law under the Roberts Court, which I find very alarming. The next step is that you say that it's too broad because I don't distinguish between the majority and the minority, and you mentioned that so if a state has an establishment, several European states do, and then you mentioned Israel, etc. Then what about the others? And so it invites claims for multiple establishment. Actually, that's what multiculturalism in this domain would look like. And I'm not talking about accommodation. There are many laws that you have no reason for the laws. Like, can you wear your hats and your things? This is a domain that I'm not really addressing. I'm addressing the far more serious stuff of when others really basic rights, for example, women's basic rights. I know it's a minor detail, but it's always at stake here. When these are at stake, then it gets serious. And so I'm not thrilled with the idea of multiple establishments. I don't like the millet system here or anywhere. I'd much rather go for now I have to be careful here, but for an approach that does not establish, let's say, one dominant religion and then give the similar rights to the others, but attempts to provide a civil state that would allow for plurality, etc. Now, I know that someone will come across, I'm looking at her, someone will say to me, well, there's always a dominant culture, there's always a dominant group, and so this liberal idea of, I guess you'd call it neutrality and partiality, is just, a fake. No. I don't think so. Not that I think that anything is ever neutral, but that I think that if that's the guiding idea of a civil state, then you can always make the claim that it's not neutral enough, and if it's not neutral enough, make it more impartial and more neutral. That would be my approach. When it comes to the most fundamental, basic rights of individuals, members or non-members. So that's the orientation that I would have, rather than, so that no group can say the state's ours, but in some sense take it off the table. Now, maybe this is a heroic assumption, but in any case, if accommodation means suspending basic rights that we fought so hard to get and that are never secure for certain groups. By the way, one last thing. Native Americans is a different box. We pretend they're sovereign, they're semi-sovereign. That's an entirely different can of worms that I think would have to have a separate. I didn't mean. It's just because the Smith case addressed them, but it's a separate box because it's not looked at as an accommodation. The pretense is that they're sovereign when they're not, and there are conquered peoples. It's quite different. Okay.
So let's open the floor for questions. Alon?
I wonder whether in substance we cannot defend the same type of accommodation on the basis of a more traditional liberal, on the basis of a more traditional liberal view, which is quite dominant, and I wonder whether it could lead to the same results. Namely, the idea that religions are not unique. There are comprehensive forms of life, this phrase that is being used. They are necessary in order for people to realize themselves and so on and so on. The so-called accommodation that we give them or provide them are merely ones that are designed to facilitate autonomy, realization of their essence and so on and so on. And so without using all this kind of rhetoric of jurisdiction and corporate bodies and so on, we grant them broad rights, and as it happens, contingently, religions are the most eminent, the most developed, comprehensive forms of life we have. So as it happens, they get most of this privilege, and this may lead to the same type of accommodations, which are, I think, may justify the same type of accommodation which you project in the paper, simply on different grounds. And
well, but then we have to explain. I think of the United States. I mean, most people don't think of the United States as intolerant of religion. I mean, it's pretty. Religions are pretty mobilized and powerful. And
the question is, then, what are they really after? What's going on here? If that's the case, comprehensive worldviews, the Rawlsian thing, and since it's not, since we don't have an established religion, there's scope and so much tolerance, and no one says you can't wear your veils or your hats. None of this goes on. We have First Amendment, the other part of the First Amendment, right?
You can't cite the Sharia in some of the states.
That's something else. That's an intolerance. But under the Constitution, but as it stands generally, that's because it's a recent immigrant group. But I'll get to that. Yes. But the point is that then you have to ask, well, what is going on here? And I think there is something new going on that's being put into the multicultural accommodation frame that doesn't belong there. That's what I think is going on. And so it's not that again, I asked for it because I used the word accommodation, but I wanted I was using it facetiously, because I think the projects of these politicized religious groups in the United States now, and they are for the most part the dominant, but they are alliances. And I guarantee you, sooner or later, the Muslims are going to be part of that alliance in the United States. The Jews already are, the Orthodox. So the point is that I think there's an agenda that is very different from live and let live, toleration, or even exemptions from laws that are benign in my view, and I have no problems with those. I don't care even if the Orthodox Jew wears his yarmulke in a prison or in an army. They care, but this is not my problem. My problem is that a group gets to violate the rights of their members and of non-members on the basis of religious, of a claim of religious autonomy and freedom. That's my problem. And, well, I'll leave it at that.
Okay, so let's take two, and then the other. Mic.
So, well, yeah.
Can you pass the mic?
Well, thanks very much, Jean. So let me try to tease open a little further your sympathy for this trusteeship idea by asking about the conception of the democratic theory that you espouse in your paper on page 15, where you make the quite bold claim that the only justification for coercive law is that it's gone through a democratic process and a democratic polity, right? That somebody's a member of. At least that's the claim in the paper. Now maybe you're just overstating it a bit.
Yeah.
So what I'm wondering about is what do you think the justification is for the application of coercive law for somebody who comes to the border?
To the border?
Yeah.
Oh, to your state border?
Yeah, to your state border, who's not part of the polity.
Okay.
Okay, so the other also? Can you pass the mic? Thank you.
Thank you. I wanted to raise a tension that I seem to see in the paper between the internal democratic deficit and the external. So if I am convinced by your argument about the need to strengthen the democratic system and the threat that the religious jurisdictional argument is making, I was confused towards the end. How do you answer a different religion, a new religion that we have from the outside, the human rights religion, that can also be understood as a competition of jurisdiction, asking not just accommodation, but asking,
Right.
And so I wonder whether you could elaborate on how does it go with your democratic theory. Do you have a democratic justification for this that is different from your argument about the religion? Because that's where I thought the argument stopped too short.
Yeah. Well, can I? Yes. I mean, it's not that I overstated it. I was addressing a different target. The target was a metasocial guarantee that references, some other metaphysical sovereign. So against that is utterly and completely antithetical to democratic legitimacy. Now, I didn't say the only legitimacy out there is democratic legitimacy. And I do think that there's a relationship or co-equivalence among human rights and democracy. And I also am sympathetic to the idea, to the problem raised by Ayal and others that of the lack of fit between the citizenry of the state and those affected by its decisions and its laws, negative externalities, all of that. And so, I think international law is legitimate, even given the fact that non-democratic states participate in making it. So I didn't mean to exclude that. I don't mean to sound like an absolutist state sovereign. On the contrary, I wrote a whole book, challenging that position. But this was addressing something else. So in that sense, regarding I don't like the discourse that human rights is a religion. I don't go for that. Nor am I a human rights fundamentalist, but I think that human rights, depends on what you're talking about. There are moral justifications. There are treaties signed by a variety of states. And domestically, democratic constitutionalism, I think, presupposes certain sets of basic systems of rights and democracy as well. So I'm not a democracy fundamentalist either.
Citizens' human rights. I'm asking about foreigners.
Okay, well, first of all,
competition with the tribunals through universal jurisdiction and so forth.
well,
And even if the state is not to this treaty, I'm
Yeah.
saying that there is a jurisdictional fight there very similar to the internal one that you described.
I understand, but for me, I think it's a very important distinction to be made between constitutional pluralism, legal pluralism that involves public powers, and the so-called legal pluralism that involves quasi-private, non-public powers like those of religious groups, status-based legal pluralism, I think is, so for example, I think that's fundamentally different than federalism, which has to do with sets of public institutional powers at different levels. To me, these are fundamentally different, and I'm not ready to go back to the private power, corporate power of any group, religious or anything else. So that's an important distinction for me. It would involve a whole discussion. Actually, I have 2 chapters in the book on that. But so yeah. Now, as for the border thing.
So you're asking whether state power, what are you saying? I mean, this debate about borders and what do you call open borders, non-open borders, you know, I mean, I think that that international law, European Union law, depending on regional law, has to at some point address all of this. But as it stands now, I'm not an advocate of totally open borders. Maybe if you're sitting in Canada, it sounds good. But if you're sitting...
The specific question isn't whether it's an open or closed door policy.
Oh.
It's a question of the state using coercion to stop you from coming in. Because the specific claim you're making in your paper is that the only justification for it is democracy, is that we give laws for ourselves. And democratic theory, it seems, is
the question's what the we is. The we, at some point, could be all of humanity, but it's not him or her who's ever up there. So the first reference is, whatever laws we have, we give them to ourselves. That's just where it's at. And now, I mean, maybe if you're religious, you don't think that. But if we're talking about these political, civil laws, that's it. Now, then the question of who the we is can be addressed. So again, I'm targeting something that's as I say to people, who would have thought that the 20th century would have been followed by the 11th? But I think this is what's happening here. And so you know, the border issue, I think, is something that could ultimately, you know, ultimately involve a different conception of a we, maybe federations across, you know, and then new treaties, new international law. I'm open to all of that. I'm not obsessed with that kind of exclusion by the demos, whoever the demos is. This can be all dealt with, but it has to be dealt with in a way in which those, I'm not sure about those affected. I'm very ambivalent about that because everybody's affected by everything. So those affected or those under the jurisdiction of, that's what this would apply to. But there's 2 borders. I mean, there's stuff on both sides, right? So,
it's a boundary question.
Yeah. So anyway, so the question is how we would then redefine the we, maybe, but it's certainly not, you know, ascribing whatever decision we make to some other power.
Okay, so I think it's a good point to move to Yal's question.
Who? Oh,
Yal.
yeah.
So I think I rephrase even and Leora's questions. So if this is a repetition, you can completely ignore and continue to the next speaker. So let's assume there is a new religion invented 1789, Paris vision. Then this religion is called nationalism, and the members of that religion believe that only the members have the right to vote, and this is a very convenient religion, which immediately unites them all because it gives them power to decide and the reason why to exclude others, and then it makes a lot of sense because. It allows them to practice their right to individual and collective self-determination, right. And this is a wonderful idea, which fits the idea of democracy, and this is why everybody is happy about it, and this is why it fits the idea of a liberal state. But once we realize that, as you say, there is no perfect fit. And this community is able to decide for others on a regular basis, on a daily basis, routinely. What distinguishes that religion called nationality with a religion called, I don't know, Christianity, Judaism, whatever, that decides not only for itself but also for the non-members of that group?
Okay.
Okay, let's take the other two questions
Okay.
because we are quite short on time. So Ivan?
Thank you. I really enjoyed this paper, and I found myself in agreement with the idea that thinking about sovereignty of church organizations as a jurisdictional matter is maybe not very helpful, but it does seem to be illuminating from one perspective, which is from the perspective of the religious observant. They experience the conflict between public law and religious law as a conflict of overlapping, conflicting obligations. And if we take that, if we recognize that subjective perspective, we may think that there are reasons why the state might give some deference to those, given that the state might lack the ability to compel compliance, for example, or we might think that its enforcement may undermine its claim to authority over, at least from the subjective perspective of those individuals. And therefore, if we think the subjective perspective matters, it may be relevant from a justice perspective. So I don't know that justice is necessarily the domain of public law excluding the religious perspective. If we take that on, I wonder, and one way I think of understanding this U.S. Supreme Court's jurisprudence is it's not saying this is a matter of where there's conflict preemption, it's a matter of abstention that we enter the domain of religion, but rather it's something closer to sort of a comedy perspective. So when we look at the regulatory prescriptive jurisdiction, at least from the U.S. law perspective, U.S. Supreme Court has moved toward a comedy perspective, right, approach. And we may or may not like that, but that's one way of a state saying we respect that there are other perspectives or interests of another state. You know, we may not like the standard review that the Supreme Court has adopted, the compelling interest test, but it's a way of trying to recognize the need to balance different, perhaps the claims that that religion may put upon the subjective experience of the observant.
Okay.
So, yeah, the question.
Okay, and Lorenzo, the last one.
Yes, my question is about the neutrality of the state. The neutrality.
The mic.
It does seem to me increasingly that well, liberal neutrality is a myth, and in particular, well, it's a myth within the liberal constitutional state that, as you say, is liberal. Well, is committed to respecting individuals as equal persons. But the point is that some of these persons are religious persons, and these religious persons are committed to the specialness of religion. So if you tell them that religion is not special, is not unique, then you are confronting a basic tension that the liberal democratic state is not capable of answering to. It's living off this basic
Okay. Very quickly. I'll take them in sort of reverse order. So with respect, I'm not a liberal neutrality person. I think that we have to bite the bullet and say we are committed to certain liberal principles. Basta. Equality, democracy, if that counts as liberal principles, gender equality, etc. And that certain claims to sovereignty, to a metasocial source of our laws, are simply incompatible with the liberal democracy, and I am not neutral or impartial about that. And I'm not neutral about that. But I would argue that impartiality and religious freedom is based on that rather than something else. First point. Second point is with respect to the nationalism thing. I mean, maybe it's because I come from America and it's not a nation state. I mean, they thought they were for a while, but they can't pull that one off. And, you know, the Constitution says all persons born or naturalized are citizens thereof. And so it's, so I don't think, so that's the first thing. Now, of course, I can't imagine what place you're thinking of where one group decides systematically for another. I mean, actually, probably every place. But anyway, then that has to be targeted and challenged. And I don't think nationalism is a justification, or nationality, or ethnic belonging, or religious identity is an appropriate justification for that. So I don't think that's I'm sorry, but I don't think that's that poses huge problems for me. I think it's something that violates the principles of liberal democratic constitutionalism on whatever level you're going to have it. So I'm not a fan of nationalism as a religion in that sense. And then the final thing is about, what was the final thing? Oh, yeah. I think we have to be clear that again, I was reading from the United States that there's a huge issue way beyond that, but yes, it's always been the case that from the perspective of some groups, in this case religious, or it could be a libertarian against the welfare state or whatever, you just think these public civil laws are terrible, they're disastrous, they violate your conscience, etc. But I mean, you know, ever since at least the first constitutional democracy was created, this is you don't each get to be a law for yourself. That's, now, again, I'm not saying, I don't go necessarily with the Smith decision, because I think that was, the Smith decision against the Native Americans, I think that was discriminatory, because you gave exemptions for the Catholics under Prohibition when they wanted to drink their wine, and the Jews too, I guess, I don't know. But so, I mean, a lot can be handled under the problem of non-discrimination, or under the frame of, it's just unnecessary to outlaw. I mean, some laws are just bad laws. You know, it's stupid and unnecessary and thoughtless. Now, it can be, my problem with the current legal frame since RFRA, and I haven't even mentioned IFRA, International Freedom of Religion Act. We haven't gone there yet with America. But in any, I mean, we haven't discussed this, but in any case, the problem is that this shifts the burden of proof. This is now no longer a question of discrete accommodations raised by a religious group that says, look, you didn't realize this, but you really burden us in an unnecessary way. The burden of proof now, this is a blanket exemption for religious groups that nobody else gets, and the state now has to demonstrate that its law follows a compelling interest and is not. This is an astounding reversal. This is huge. I don't think people realize how huge this shift really is, and we're about to see it come down with a sledgehammer, because I'm afraid they're going to decide in favor of this Hobby Lobby group that's owned by two fundamentalists, two I can't remember which partisan group it is, that has. They sell hobby goods, you know, sports stuff. And they have 13,000 employees who had no idea they were joining a religious corporation. They thought they were employees of a for-profit corporation. And we're going to see what the court does. I think the court's going to give it to them. But that's an astonishing thing if it happens. Anyway, I'll leave it at that. I think that things are not, I don't think that what we're dealing with here is, you know, let the minorities have their thing, accommodation, all that kind of, you know, relatively benign stuff. I think we're dealing now with something far more alarming and problematic, where the rights of people, and especially everywhere, in every religion, of women, are on the line. That's what I think.
So, please join me in thanking Jean.
Thank you.